которая называется таблица Менделеева. И вы с этой таблицей будете очень-очень много работать. Вам здесь нужно запомнить первые 3 строчки. Это те атомы, с которыми вы будете сталкиваться постоянно. Все атомы разные по размеру. И наши шарики, в данном случае, вот это атом водорода. А вот это атом хлора. Видите, что они отличаются по размеру. Далее у нас идет атом кислорода. Это О. И вы скажете, а чем они отличаются, кроме цвета? Они отличаются дырочками. Если в атоме хлора одна дырочка, это значит валентность 1. А у кислорода 2 дырочки, это значит валентность 2. Что такое валентность? Обязательно посмотрите. У нас есть супер-мега крутое видео. И вам это понадобится, тема валентность, абсолютно в каждой последующей теме. Итак, давайте возвращаться к нашим атомам. Атом углерода имеет 4 дырочки, у него валентность 4. Атом серы имеет 6 дырочек, у него валентность 6. И азот имеет 5 дырочек, у него валентность 5. И вот все эти атомы есть в таблице Менделеева. Вот водород, углерод, азот, кислород, сера. Когда атомам становится скучно, они начинают соединяться в молекулы. И образуются следующие вещества. Например, молекула водорода. Молекула водорода – это H2. И как вы догадались, она состоит из 2 атомов водорода. Молекула водорода. Кислород, когда соединяется друг с другом, образуется молекула кислорода. О2. Кислород – это то, чем мы дышим, то, что используется в реакциях горения. Кислород, О2. Вы могли обратить внимание, что между водородами одна связь, а между кислородами 2 связи. Это опять-таки зависит от валентности элементов, от количества тех дырочек, которые я вам показывал. Поэтому обязательно посмотрите наши видео по валентности. Далее. Вода. Наверняка вы не раз слышали такую молекулу H2O. Молекула воды состоит из одного атома кислорода и 2 атомов водорода. Видите, такая молекула похожа на мишку. А вот это CH3COOH, это уксусная кислота. Мама не раз наверняка использовала в процессе приготовления уксусную кислоту. Уксус в простонародье CH3COOH. Смотрите, и вот эта вот большая молекула, это вот она. CH3COOH. C, это черный шарик. H3, C, O, O и еще один H. CH3COOH. И еще есть одна молекула, которую бы я вам хотел показать. CH4. Это метан. Уверен, что вы опять-таки не раз слышали это. Если при слове таблица Менделеева вы говорите «Чё?», тогда обязательно посмотри это видео до конца, потому что я здесь покажу, как пользоваться таблицей Менделеева и добывать кучу полезной информации, которая будет использоваться в твоих контрольных работах. Поэтому подпишись на наш канал, чтобы следить за нашими новостями, и смотри видео до конца. Поехали! Ребята, сегодня я научу вас, как можно пользоваться таблицей Менделеева. На самом деле отсюда можно извлечь очень много полезной информации. И я сегодня сделаю так, что для вас это будет не просто какая-то там таблица на форзаце учебника, а реально полезный инструмент на уроках химии. Ребята, таблица Менделеева бывает короткая и длинная. Я буду пользоваться длинным вариантом, и здесь лантаноиды и актиноиды вынесены в отдельные ряды. Я их вообще вырезал, потому что мы ими пользоваться не будем. Вся информация сосредоточена именно здесь. Итак, нужно знать структуру периодической системы, что означают где какие циферки. Итак, вертикальный столбец называется группа. Группа бывает А главная, Б побочная. Горизонтальный ряд называется период. Видите, здесь их 7 штук, 7 периодов. Периоды бывают малые первый, второй, третий. Здесь небольшое количество химических элементов. И большие периоды, четвертый, пятый, шестой и седьмой. Итак, какую же информацию нам дают группы и периоды? Номер группы показывает количество электронов на внешнем уровне. Если вы вообще не поняли, что я сказал, тогда обязательно посмотрите наши видео по строению атома. Кстати, ребята, я провожу занятия для ребят, которые хотят сдавать ОГЭ, ЕГЭ, ЦТ и просто поднять оценку. Поэтому найдите мой инстаграм, пишите мне в директ, я работаю с ребятами онлайн и офлайн из России и Беларуси. Буду рад видеть вас на моих занятиях. Итак, возвращаемся к таблице. Количество электронов на внешнем уровне показывает номер группы. А период показывает количество этих энергетических.
फ्रेंड और एनीवन इफ दे टेलिंग यू कि बहुत सारे रिसोर्सेज पढ़ लो अपने इंस्टीट्यूट के वो भी कर लो, ज़्यादा पढ़ोगे तो इट्स ऑलवेज बेटर, अगर ज़्यादा पढ़ा हो तो बेटर काम ही आता है एंड इट्स ऑलवेज गुड फॉर यू ओनली. नो इट्स नॉट. आई मीन नीट में एनसीईआरटी से बाहर आती ही नहीं है इनऑर्गेनिक. फ्रेंड और एनीवन इफ दे टेलिंग यू कि बहुत सारे रिसोर्सेज पढ़ लो अपने इंस्टीट्यूट के वो भी कर लो.
There are really four ways that I see in which your organic chemistry experience is going to be different from your general chemistry experience. The first is that organic chemistry is heuristic and not algorithmic. And by this, I mean that organic chemistry deals with heuristics. A simpler word for heuristics is simply rules. Whereas general chemistry, you can get by thinking about general chemistry in terms of algorithms, which are much more like deductive processes, meaning they take an input of information, and this is usually quantitative information in terms of a set of numbers, and you apply a series of steps to that information, and out comes an answer, and often that answer is also quantitative. And so while it's often a big struggle to get general or introductory chemistry students used to the idea that you have to think about chemical models and the submicroscopic picture and the concepts underlying problem solving, the actual act of problem solving itself is often deductive in nature. That's not often the case in organic chemistry. Organic chemistry more often deals with rules. And an analogy I like to use here is the analogy of driving and the rules of the road. When you're driving a car and you're obeying these so-called rules of the road, it's not exactly a deductive process. You're not following a step-by-step series of actions that get you from your starting point to your destination. You may change your approach midway through. You may decide on a route based on how you've always done things and check Google Maps halfway through your drive and change your route. You may change around the sequence of steps you use to start the car based on extra luggage you have, things like this. The rules that we talk about in heuristic reasoning are things that are not necessarily set in stone the way an algorithm is set in stone. They're probabilistic. And as you progress in your education, it's going to become ever more important to start thinking probabilistically, meaning you're weighting possibilities by the likelihood of their being correct or coming true or being reasonable. For example, we're going to talk a lot about situations and concepts and problems that involve probabilistic reasoning where you're making decisions. And this is all about heuristics or rules. The second way organic chemistry differs from general chemistry is that it's process-oriented, not answer-oriented. And we kind of got at this in the last example. But the idea here is that whereas the idea in general chemistry is often to get to, quote unquote, the answer, right? There's some number we're trying to get to, and often that number has value, right? Maybe we're trying to get to the pressure of a gas using the ideal gas law, or the number of moles we need to use in a chemical reaction, for example. In introductory chemistry, the answer, quote unquote, is often our end goal. But in organic chemistry, it's all about the process. And this gets back to the heuristic reasoning point. We're applying these rules in a process-oriented manner to translate information we're given, which is often visual, which will come in the next point, into an answer that is not necessarily the answer, but one of a number of possibilities that, probabilistically speaking, is the most likely to be true, or the most likely outcome to take place. And I strongly encourage you to think in a process-oriented manner in Chem 2311 rather than an answer-oriented manner. This answer-oriented approach to organic chemistry is what gives it its reputation for being a memorization-driven course. This is in fact not true at all if you approach organic chemistry from a process-oriented standpoint. It's about the heuristics you apply, how you apply them, which is the process involved, and how you translate applying those heuristics into often a visual output in the form of an organic structure. The third way organic chemistry differs from introductory chemistry is that it's visual, not quantitative. It's often qualitative rather than quantitative. So where we use numbers in introductory chemistry to represent various experimental variables, for example, we tend to use pictures in organic chemistry. And so, the typical thing here, and something that we're going to use throughout this course and your next organic course, is Lewis structures. For example, we're going to deepen the theory of Lewis structures. We're going to connect Lewis structures to deeper concepts from physical chemistry. And so all of the information that you're going to learn in organic chemistry is going to be filtered through a visual system, through the visual system of Lewis structures. So for example, interpreting Lewis structures visually, something I'll talk about here in a second, is going to become extremely important throughout your time in organic chemistry. Finally, organic chemistry is about complexity and depth rather than simplicity and breadth. So the way I like to think about this is in introductory chemistry, we're serving a large student population. Students come from a variety of majors and are in the course for a variety of purposes. And so simplicity and breadth are valuable. It's a general chemistry course that gives the student a general sense of how chemistry works. But those who take organic chemistry are to some extent, to a greater or lesser extent, going to use that understanding in their actual profession. And so simplicity and breadth are valuable. Finally, organic chemistry is about complexity and depth rather than simplicity and breadth. So the way I like to think about this is in introductory chemistry, we're serving a large student population. Students come from a variety of majors and are in the course for a variety of purposes. And so simplicity and breadth are valuable. It's a general chemistry course that gives the student a general sense of how chemistry works. But those who take organic chemistry are to some extent, to a greater or lesser extent, going to use that understanding in their actual profession. And so we're moving from a more generalized understanding to a more professional or specialized understanding of how chemistry works. And in particular, we're going to do things like, for example, take that idea of Lewis structures and really drill down deep into what a Lewis structure represents in terms of orbital theory and in terms of electron density and how to interpret a Lewis structure and infer reactivity from it. So it's about complexity and depth, and you want to keep that in mind as well, moving through organic chemistry, that it's less about generalized understanding and more about specialization. That what we're moving from a more generalized understanding to a more professional or specialized understanding of how chemistry works. Purposes. And so simplicity and breadth are valuable. It's a general chemistry course that gives the student a general sense of how chemistry works. But those who take organic chemistry are, to some extent, to a greater or lesser extent, going to use that understanding in their actual profession. And so we're moving from a more generalized understanding to a more professional or specialized understanding of how chemistry works. And in particular, we're going to do things like, for example, take that idea of Lewis structures and really drill down deep into what a Lewis structure represents in terms of orbital theory and in terms of electron density and how to interpret a Lewis structure and infer reactivity from it. So it's about complexity and depth, and you want to keep that in mind as well, moving through organic chemistry, that it's less about generalized understanding and more about specialization. So finally, I want to end by talking just a little bit about skill in organic chemistry and what that looks like and what that means, using the analogy of analyzing a chess position. So I'll be honest, I am quite a bit of a chess nerd, and I like this analogy of analyzing a chess position as compared to analyzing an organic reaction, because both are associated with tons of information that's going on underneath the surface. You really have to drill down to, in the case of the chemistry, the physical chemistry and the underlying thermodynamics and things like this, the underlying concepts, to apply the process of analyzing an organic reaction rationally. And the same is true in a chess position. If you look at a chess master analyzing a chess position, they recognize all kinds of things that the average player won't recognize. Things like squares that can't be protected by a pawn, right? There's nothing on that square, so there's not necessarily a visual indicator that that's an issue in the position. But to a master, that's going to be a really important factor. The material count, so that's applying a systematic process to the position and looking at the pieces on black side versus the pieces on white side, and looking at, are those counts equal or not? This is just two examples of a number of ideas, but the take-home message here is that there's tons going on in a chess position that goes deeper than just the locations of the pieces on the board. The same is true in an organic reaction. For example, in this reaction, to see what's really going on, we have to ask, what's the role of this molecule right here? What's the role of this molecule? What's the likely role then of the organic substrate? What atom within the organic substrate is the most reactive? What are the underlying physical and organic principles that lead us to make these decisions? These are the heuristics that I was referring to earlier. None of this process is going to be apparent when you're just given an organic reaction to analyze, but that's why I want you to think in a process-oriented manner, so that you understand that that's the expectation when you're given an organic reaction to analyze, is to make these decisions using these rules that we'll practice in class and that you'll see in videos throughout the semester. Finally, I want to close with a really nice graphic that I actually got from my graduate advisor about problem solving in organic chemistry. This summarizes the discussion in the video so far. So problems in organic chemistry are complex. There's really no getting around that. But the approach we apply can be systematic. Complex doesn't mean that the problem is unsolvable. It means things like the problem is multi-step, multifaceted, not algorithmic, uncharted or new territory for you or for science as a whole. And to negotiate that, we use strategies like intuition from previous problems we've solved. whether that be accurate or biased. We use rules of thumb or heuristics to generate a solution. We reason by analogy, taking advantage of previous situations we've seen to reason about new situations. And then occasionally, and this is a nice analogy to the chess situation as well, we just have to get into detailed analysis and start enumerating possibilities and evaluating those possibilities against each other. It's analogous to running moves in our head in a chess position and seeing how the position ends up. This is going to get us to a list of initial options, and there are multiple options. Right? And in terms of thinking probabilistically, we could do something like apply a probability to each of these. Maybe our answer by accurate intuition, has an 80% chance of being correct, roughly speaking. Maybe our biased intuition has a 5% chance. Maybe we've got another answer involving reasoning by analogy that maybe has a 15% chance of correctness. So there's some risk involved here, right? Because we're generating probabilities. We may or may not be correct. All of these strategies we're using are not deductive in nature. They're based on probabilistic thinking. So there's some risk involved. We then have to choose an option. So for example, we might choose option A based on the 80% probability, advance toward the solution using principle A, whatever that may be, and then we evaluate our progress. And if we've failed according to this evaluation, well, that's not terrible. We just go back to our list of initial options and restart the process using, for example, our next most likely solution. So there's uncertainty here, there's risk involved, and there's the potential of failure. But to approach organic chemistry the right way, you want to make these mistakes early on. And you want to have a process that enables you to evaluate at the end so that you can go back and try another possibility if needed. This involves a good bit of work. And although you may see people around you making this look easy, this is actually the process that expert organic chemists apply when evaluating an answer to an organic problem like drawing a product or a mechanism or something like this. There's always some level of uncertainty and risk involved in this process. And so keep that in mind, that failure is not a terminal condition, certainly in this course or in life in general. Failure presents a learning opportunity, an opportunity to go back and not only choose a different option, but adjust your intuition, adjust your rules of thumb, and adjust the way you approach detailed analysis to make you a better reasoner in the long run. Welcome to Chem 2311. My name is Dr. Mike Evans, and really quickly here, I'm going to go through learning objectives for Chem 2311 as I see them. The first thing we want to be able to do is describe and use the electronic and spatial structures of organic molecules to predict reactivity. So we're going to, for example, look at a Lewis structure, something like this. This is the molecule ethyl bromide, and identify within it key points of reactivity and how they react. And so this may not make much sense yet, but for example, this carbon is partially positive, the bromine is partially negative. That gives us insight into reactivity. When it comes to spatial structures, this is all about stereochemistry. And so we'll dive deeper into the world of stereochemistry, looking at stereoisomerism and even relationships between groups within a molecule that have nothing to do with electronics, but more so to do with the spatial differences between those groups. Next, we have the ability to analyze spectroscopic data. So spectroscopic data is really the foundational empirical evidence for organic chemistry. And so we have an opportunity in Chem 2311 to really see where organic chemistry came from, quote unquote, how we know that all these reactions occur, how we know that electron flow happens this way. It's all about spectroscopic data. And we'll look in particular at infrared spectroscopy, which is going to look something like this, where the percent transmittance is graphed here, and it's all about infrared light. And we're going to look at nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which is an extremely valuable technique for organic structural characterization because it tells us not just about the electronic or functional group nature of what shows up in a molecule, but also how things are connected based on a phenomenon that's called coupling. And so NMR spectroscopy is going to be a valuable tool for us as well throughout the course. We're going to apply qualitative reasoning strategies to predict mechanisms of products, and I've already talked about this at length. We'll be using these ideas throughout almost every unit in the course. And to really apply those strategies, we're going to master some conceptual and conventional foundations of organic chemistry, like the curved arrow formalism, how to draw Lewis structures and handle resonance, localized molecular orbital theory, which is a physical, organic overlay on top of the curved arrow formalism, essentially, that helps explain why electrons move the way they do, and the stability factors, the structural aspects that tell us about the thermodynamic stability of molecules. And then finally, we're going to synthesize molecules using rationally designed sequences of reactions. So we'll learn a variety of chemical reactions throughout the course, and we're going to put these together into synthetic sequences so that we can start with relatively simple molecules and construct complex molecules out of them. Organic synthesis provides us with an interesting context to apply our understanding of organic reactions because we're building up complex molecules with greater utility and seeing how reactions fit together into larger patterns. So finally, I want to end by talking just a little bit about skill in organic chemistry and what that looks like and what that means, using the analogy of analyzing a chess position. So I'll be honest, I am quite a bit of a chess nerd, and I like this analogy of analyzing a chess position as compared to analyzing an organic reaction because both are associated with tons of information that's going on underneath the surface. You really have to drill down to, in the case of the chemistry, the physical chemistry and the underlying A good place to start when you're studying organic chemistry is with the various ways that organic molecules are represented. Because they tend to involve a lot of bonds and a lot of atoms, we make use of shorthand and some shortcuts and conventions to represent structure. And becoming familiar with these conventions is going to be really important as you progress through your studies of organic structures and reactions. And so in this unit, we're going to draw and interpret representations of structures of organic compounds that incorporate these shorthand conventions. And we're going to learn how to interpret the shorthand to expand implied hydrogen atoms and lone pairs. And this idea that we should expand implied hydrogens around reactive centers was taught to me years ago by Bob Grossman at the University of Kentucky, and he rather narcissistically called it Grossman's rule. We're going to learn about functional groups. We're going to introduce the concept of a functional group and learn how to identify and label them. We'll also interpret three-dimensional representations of organic structures using wedges and dashes for the time being to represent bonds that are pointed out of the screen or out of the page and back into the screen or page. Now, in the second half of this unit, we're going to turn our attention to the limitations of the Lewis model, the limitations of these typical bond line structures that we draw with lines and dots representing electrons. This model of structure, the Lewis model, cuts against what we understand about the quantum mechanical nature of electrons and electron delocalization. And to account for electron delocalization without entirely throwing away the Lewis model, we make use of what's called resonance, a concept and a set of conventions and practices and ideas, really a whole theory, that enables us to retain Lewis structures and bond line structures while still accounting for electron delocalization. And so a big difference, if you've seen resonance previously in your introductory courses, a big difference when you get to organic chemistry is you're going to need to be able to recognize when resonance is relevant to a compound. When does a given structure have a significant alternative resonance form that we should be thinking about? We're going to talk about that in this unit so that as we come across Lewis structures of organic molecules in future studies will be able to recognize and identify when resonance is in play. And resonance has to do with the delocalization of charge and delocalization of electrons. To the extent that we're interested in how electrons move and what electrons can do, recognizing the relevance of resonance is extremely important. And to close off this unit, we'll distinguish between localized lone pairs, which are well described by the Lewis model, and delocalized lone pairs that are engaged in resonance. You'll hear me refer to these as resonance active lone pairs. The electrons we're pushing around as we interconvert between resonance structures. Resonance has important structural implications, primarily related to hybridization, geometry, and bond length. And so where resonance is in play, these resonance active atoms and electron pairs, we need to deepen our understanding of hybridization and geometry beyond the introductory level to some degree, and we'll do that in this unit. This slide introduces three representations of organic compounds, one of which has essentially all of the information about structure that we would want to care about as far as how the atoms are connected and where the electrons are located, and the other two have some compression of information, which really hides some of the visual complexity that's not super important to the properties or reactivity of the molecule, making things more efficient and more easy to parse. So the first we've seen before, it's Lewis structures. Lewis structures show all the atoms and bonds in the molecule and generally account for all of the valence electrons, including non-bonding electrons. So you see non-bonding electron pairs as pairs of dots and bonds as lines, and we can have single, double, and triple bonds represented with 1, 2, and 3 lines respectively in Lewis structures. There's no geometric information here necessarily in a Lewis structure, and we'll talk about the three-dimensional conventions for organic molecules here a little bit down the line. But when you see this kind of right angle representation where we've got an atom that clearly should be tetrahedral, for example here at the center, the central carbon, with sort of cross-like bonds, there's no geometric information implied here. A partially condensed structure takes the CH bonds and just puts carbon and hydrogen next to each other. And it's implied that the carbon and hydrogens are linked to each other. So if you see something like a CHN, so CH, CH2, CH3, this means N hydrogens linked to that carbon atom. So a CH3, for example, has 3 hydrogens all linked to this carbon. And because hydrogen forms one and only one bond, we can infer in these partially condensed and in the fully condensed structures, where we even omit the carbon-carbon bonds, that the heavy atoms are linked to each other. So in a fully condensed structure like this, it's pure text, no lines, no dots. Lone pairs are often hidden as well, although you'll sometimes see lone pairs written around the heteroatoms, non-carbon and non-hydrogen, like this. So this condensed structure implies that the carbons are linked to each other and carbon is linked to oxygen. So there's a bond here between C and O, and there's a bond between one of these C's and this C, and the other carbon implied by this CH3 is also linked to that carbon at the center. Because hydrogen forms one and only one bond, it's implied and assumed that hydrogen is linked to whichever atom is closest to it in the condensed formula. So for example, this H is linked to the carbon that comes right before it in the formula, and this hydrogen is linked to this oxygen to form it. OH or hydroxyl group. Let's practice expanding a condensed structure to a full-blown Lewis structure on this slide. So we have this condensed structure in blue. It's pure text except for this equals sign looking symbol, which indicates a double bond between these two carbons. I think it's helpful here to start to number the carbons, just to make sure that we account for every atom that's implied by this condensed formula. Notice, for example, that the CH3 in parentheses with the subscript 2 implies 2 methyl groups linked to carbon 3. So let's number those methyl carbons 1 and 2. Carbons 3 and 4 are linked by a double bond, and notice that we have an H here that is linked directly to carbon 4. It follows it immediately in the condensed formula, implying that it is directly connected to carbon 4. And carbons 5 and 6 are linked to each other and form a separate group that's also linked to carbon 4. So this can be easy to miss in the formula, but the highlighting hopefully makes this clear that the H and the CH2-CH3 group are independently linked to carbon 4. So now that we've sort of parsed through the condensed formula like this, we can draw the carbon skeleton, and this is what I would encourage you to do next. We've got carbons 3 and 4 at the middle linked by this double bond. And we already said there are 2 methyl groups, 2 CH3 groups, CH3 is known as the methyl group, linked to carbon 3, and those are carbons 1 and 2. On the other side, we have carbons 5 and 6 that are linked to carbon 4. Specifically, carbon 5 is linked to carbon 4, and carbon 6, which follows carbon 5 in the condensed formula, is linked to carbon 5. So this is our carbon skeleton. We've accounted for all of the carbons in the structure at this point, carbons 1 through 6. Next up is to add the hydrogens. To add the hydrogens, look for the H's that are next to the carbons or other atoms in the condensed formula. So here we've got 3 H's adjacent to each C inside parentheses. So we're going to have 3 hydrogens linked to carbons 1 and 2, 3 hydrogens each. Carbon 4 has that orange highlighted hydrogen that it's also linked to. Carbon 5 has 2 hydrogens linked to it, CH2, implies a structure like this. And then carbon 6 is another methyl group, another CH3, with 3 hydrogens linked to the carbon. And now notice here one more time that the H highlighted in orange is a separate group from the CH2-CH3. Both are linked to carbon 4, but they're linked independent of one another. And if we follow this idea that H's immediately following a heavy atom are linked to that heavy atom, this is a convention for condensed structures, we'll be able to parse out condensed structures to infer structures like this. One more thing that I'll point out before we leave this slide is that every carbon in this structure is satisfying the octet rule, 4 bonds, right? 8 total electrons. The hydrogens are satisfying the so-called duet rule, right? Each of those has 2 total electrons, and we account for the double bond that's built into the condensed formula. Double and triple bonds do typically appear in condensed formulas to make it very clear where double and triple bonds exist between carbons in these condensed formulas. One other thing we should note before moving forward is that condensed structures are generally only used for relatively simple structures without a lot of branching. When you start getting a lot of branching in the structure, it becomes very difficult and in some cases impossible to actually parse out just a line of text, right? And so condensed structural formulas are generally only used when we have a relatively simple structure with very little branching. If we look, for example, at a molecule like amoxicillin, there's just absolutely no way that we could fit that into a reasonable, meaningful condensed formula. Even representing rings with a condensed formula gets rather tricky. And if we look at the full-blown Lewis structure here, there's tons of visual complexity, tons of lines, tons of dots, tons of letters. This is way too complicated to draw any useful information out of it in anything resembling an efficient amount of time, right?
It's just too complicated. So we've developed a shorthand to hide a lot of that visual complexity without sacrificing important aspects of the structure that are relevant to its properties and reactivity, the properties and reactivity of the compound. And these are known as bond line structures. The first thing that bond line structures do is take every carbon atom and basically just erase it, saying that at every confluence of bonds, everywhere where bonds come together, there is a carbon located there. So for example, this is just two of many examples in the structure of amoxicillin. We've got a carbon here where we see 3 bonds coming together. We've got a carbon here where we see 4 bonds coming together. The wedges and dashes we'll touch on in a second. These are meant to represent 3-dimensional information within the structure. The geometry is also, in bond line structures, is closer to the sort of nature accurate geometry. For example, 109.5 degree bond angles at tetrahedral carbon. Carbons linked by triple bonds are typically drawn with linear geometry because that is their actual geometry in the true molecule, right? That's just Vesper theory at work. Now, one thing we'll notice about these carbons, in particular this one highlighted at the top here, is that it appears to only have 3 bonds and 6 total electrons. But this is another aspect of the bond line shorthand. There's a hydrogen missing here, and it's assumed that each carbon bears enough so-called implied hydrogen atoms to satisfy the octet rule, to have 8 electrons total. So for example here, this carbon, if we just look at the black bonds, appears to only have 3 bonds, 6 total electrons. This means there's an implied hydrogen at that carbon that we can draw in, and it's a good idea to draw these in at carbons in the vicinity of a reactive center, or a place where, for whatever reason, we're paying attention to that carbon atom. We should generally draw in all the implied hydrogens. This implied hydrogen here brings that carbon up to 4 bonds. It satisfies the octet rule. Finally, lone pairs. Lone pairs are often omitted in bond line structures, but again, we assume that there are enough lone pairs there that the atom is satisfying the octet rule. So this oxygen, for example, appears to only have 2 bonds, one to this H and one to this carbon, only 4 total electrons. It's got 2 lone pairs to bring it up to satisfying the octet rule and its formal charge, its neutral formal charge. This atom has 6 electrons formally for the purposes of the formal charge electron count. And so we can omit those and we can draw those in. And again, when you're pushing electrons or thinking about electrons doing things, it's a very, very good idea to go ahead and draw these in. And you'll see me do this when we work through reaction mechanisms and reaction products and things later in the course. Hydrogens. Let's loop back to hydrogens for a second. At heteroatoms, which are neither carbon nor hydrogen, hydrogens are never omitted. Hydrogens linked to heteroatoms are never left out. We've got to show the number of hydrogens linked to any non-carbon atom. So here, for example, OH, this H could never be omitted. In H here, this H is always drawn in. When that H is missing, in Lewis structures and all the abbreviated representations of Lewis structures we've seen so far, electrons are confined to either a single nucleus as a non-bonding lone pair or 2 nuclei in a chemical bond. Electrons are either lone pairs or bonding pairs. But in many molecules, electrons are actually smeared out over 3 or more atoms. Electrons are quantum mechanical, after all, right? They're wave-like, they're delocalized, they're probabilistic in their position. They can be smeared out over all of the atoms of a molecule. And delocalized electrons can't really be faithfully represented using a single Lewis structure. So while the Lewis structural formalism is very, very good in many, many cases, there are a number of cases in organic chemistry where electrons in organic molecules cannot be represented by a single Lewis structure. And to introduce this idea in an organic context, I wanted to look at this cation. It's known as the allyl or allylic cation, and it has a carbon with formal positive charge linked to a carbon-carbon double bond. If we think about where that positive charge is located in this structure, well, it's very clear, right? It's jumping right out at us. That carbon on the right is positively charged. The other 2 atoms are neutral, including this CH2 group here on the left. So we've got a charged atom on the right and a neutral atom on the left. And we would expect, if we did calculations of the electron density in this molecule, we'd see more electron density on one side of the molecule than the other, right? With the positive charge sitting on one of the carbons and the other carbon being neutral. But this is not what we see. If you do a quantum chemical calculation of the structure of allocation, and you look at the electron density relative to the nuclear charges to determine the charge on each atom, what you find is that the charges on the two ends are actually equal. Never mind the fact that they're negatively charged, which is sort of beyond our scope for the moment and has to do with the fact that carbon is more electronegative than hydrogen. The important point for us now is that these are equal in magnitude, which is definitely not what's shown in this Lewis representation of allocation. There's another representation of allocation, though, with positive charge on the other carbon, and we can make that by shifting the pi electrons over. We can imagine taking this pair of pi electrons and moving them over like this to generate this structure that I've just added on the right. What this shows is that the two pi electrons in allocation, these two electrons that we shifted over to generate the other resonance form, as we'll call it, are delocalized over all three atoms in the structure. And neither individual Lewis structure is a sufficient representation of the quantum chemical structure of the molecule that we see here. We actually need both representations to properly depict or fully depict In this video, we're going to work some problems from Practice Exam 3.1 in the spring 2023 semester, starting with questions related to balancing redox reactions, electrochemistry.
In this video, I'd like to introduce some of the terminology and concepts we'll use. used to describe the building blocks of organic chemistry.
I mean, we actually are a very funny community. Hunter, if you're watching, I mean, we actually are a very funny community. We make jokes all the time. This is not the normal vibes of the community, okay? The one chatter does not reflect the broader. It's a very fun community. We love jokes. Unless you hate jokes, in which case first and foremost, at the top of the docket, we're going to be talking about Hunter Schafer. Hunter Schafer is amazing. I love her. She is my queen. I have a standing invite, an open invite to Hunter Schafer to come on the broadcast anytime, any place. I will go to her if she needs it. I would love to have her on the broadcast. Obviously, she's amazing, and it's not because. And don't get like weird thoughts in your mind. It's not because she's insanely hot. Obviously, that is not a bad thing. But also because she literally got arrested for protesting Israel at 30 Rock. Anyway, that was awesome. That was very cool. She has not replied to my DMs. It's fine. I'm not hurt by it. You know, she's probably too busy and doing movies and also getting her feet scanned by Hideo Kojima. It's okay. It's okay. It's not the end of the world. It's fine. I'm not disappointed that she has not replied to my DM. She's probably very busy and also, you know, working on stuff. But like I said, open invitation to Hunter Schafer whenever she wants, anytime, any place, to come on the Hasanabi broadcast. All right. I'm washed. I'm so washed, dude. Hunter in the Mugler Angel Elixir ad is a literal goddess. Yeah, she didn't see it, and I'm not hurt by it. I think it's normal. It's cool. I like that she has not replied to my DMs. I think it's okay. It's cool, actually. Anyway, let's continue. So, as we talked about before, the Trump administration did a bunch of insane things, and one of the first executive actions they took was to, for no real reason whatsoever, declare that there are only two genders, and also you have to, you know, forcibly have your gender be your gender assigned to you at birth. And for that reason, of course, many trans people who had to go and get new passports in this new administration literally got the wrong sex on their passports. Hunter Schafer is a prominent and very famous example of that. Here she is talking about her experiences. Let's take a look.
Hello, internet. I don't really post much these days, but I had a bit of a harsh reality check today and felt like it's important to share with whoever is listening. So I'm sure most of us remember on, I think, the first day of Trump's presidency, he signed an executive order to declare only two genders recognized by the state, male and female, assigned at birth. And as a result of this, which I wrote down because I want to get...
For the record, if you're wondering, what's the point of all this? It's cruelty. Literally nothing else. It's such a hollow, such a shallow, pointlessly, unnecessarily cruel thing to do. And also, not only is it cruel, but it's also obviously unproductive. Okay? It's unproductive and chaotic because absolutely zero people look at Hunter Schafer and go, that's a man. Okay. No one does that, because gender, at the end of the day, no matter how much Republicans or dumbasses online claim is directly associated with your sex, it's biology, it is a social construct. It is what you wear, it is how you present yourself, it is how you carry yourself. And of course, for that reason, we don't, do penis checks or checks before we have normal interactions with other people in the real world. We just assume, okay, this person is a woman. Okay, gender is performative. It is a performance. But this misunderstanding has caused many people to behave in ridiculous ways. And of course, passing is not the end all be all. For those of you who say, oh, well, it's, you're just only talking about people who pass or whatever. It's just that it is a very good entry point into the conversation for many people. Okay. For the average transphobic person, it's a really solid entry point into the conversation. Okay. Because it bricks their brain in the opposite direction. When you show them someone like Hunter Schafer, and then you're like, you have to call this person a man now. They go, what are you saying? Like, that doesn't make any sense. That is why I talk about it from this perspective. It's an entry point. It's not the end all be all before people, go crazy over it. Anyway, let's take a look.
The Bureau of Consular Affairs has frozen passport applications requesting a gender marker change or renewals or new applications with a gender marker differing from an applicant's gender assigned at birth. So my initial reaction to this, because our president, is a lot of talk, was like, I'll believe it when I see it. And today, I saw it on my new passport.
Like, this is such a fucking insane thing to do. Okay? What absolute insanity. Hunter Schafer's from New Jersey, and she still hasn't been on the broadcast. We have touched the same soil, Hunter. Okay? What more? What more has to happen here? Okay? That's what it says on my passport too. Mine says New Jersey, USA as well. Okay? I'm just saying. That's what it says on mine as well. Hello? It's like we align a lot on many issues, and I think it would be great and very productive if you came on the broadcast. That's all I'm saying, okay? That's all this is. That's all I'm saying, okay? Lamau, did you just cover this as a way to publicly beg her to come on stream? No, that's just me making jokes, chatter. The reason why I'm talking about this is because I've already talked about this at the beginning when the executive order came in. But obviously, when a famous celebrity is experiencing, when a beloved famous celebrity is also experiencing the same issues that the average trans chatters in my community are experiencing, don't you think that it's really good to hyper focus on it so that, more people are aware of it? Anyway, Hunter, if you're watching, we actually are a very funny community. We make jokes all the time. This is not the normal vibes of the community, okay? The one chatter, it does not reflect the broader. It's a very fun community. We love jokes, unless you hate jokes, in which case we hate jokes. We've never joked ever before. We've never even thought about joking. But otherwise, very, very fun ha-has are to be had here. So anyway, let's continue.
Male. So now to specify, my gender markers were first changed in my teens when I first got my driver's license, and then passports following. All have been female since then. Hasn't really been a problem. However, last year when I was filming in Barcelona, our car got broken into and my bag got stolen, and inside of that was my past me, up until my 30s. I got an emergency passport, which was very simple at the time. It's basically just a copy of my old passport, but temporary and only supposed to be used within the year. So as soon as I got back to the States, I had to get this fixed and get it replaced with a real proper passport, which I went to.
I'm confused. While perverse enough, I thought the executive order simply said that there were two genders, not that someone who was once one sex and has become another cannot stay that gender. Yeah, of course. Look, anytime someone says anything about gender in the opposite direction as the wokes, they just mean like they want to shit on trans people. Okay? Just like when people talk about fairness in sports, they don't actually care about fairness in women's sports, okay? They just don't want trans people to exist, and this is a permissible way to say, fuck trans people. That's it. I've tried to explain this to people over and over again. Some people might genuinely think this conversation is actually about fairness in sports. Like, they might have actually been lost in the sauce. There are plenty of people like that. Okay, plenty of people think, on the one hand, trans people are unfairly discriminated against, and secondly, they should be nowhere near any athletic endeavor. Okay, that is real. That's a real person. That is the average American person, the median position. Okay, having said that, the conversation was started specifically on the boundaries of finding new ways to say trans people should be eradicated from public existence. That's it. And that is precisely what's going on here as well. They'll say, oh, only two genders. Come on, that makes sense.
Maud, aka Muad'Dib for Nerdist. Hi, how are you? This is my first one of these.
I've been doing them. This was my first. I'm down to it. I'm googling June popcorn bucket. I don't understand what's happening. What?
Oh, you don't know about the AMC popcorn bucket?
No,
You have
that.
Maud, aka Muad'Dib for Nerdist. Hi.
Mark Cuban lied. How this face became a billionaire. It's all a lie. Maybe this guy started everything and Mark Cuban screwed him over harder than anyone's been screwed in the history of tech, and I'll prove it. What I found is shocking.
All the streaming, everything YouTube does, we started that.
You started that?
It was called AudioNet, and we started in 1995.
We started streaming? Don't be so modest, Mark Cuban. Who was the real tech genius who single-handedly invented streaming?
How much technical savvy was required? How much did you understand could do yourself?
I did all the technology, and then we hired engineer after engineer after engineer to implement it. And so,
wow,
yeah, from putting together a multicast network to software to just all these different.
Inventors invent. Mark did the technology, and it started with ROI.
ROI. ROI. You know what that stands for?
Return on
investment. Nope. Radio on Internet.
Radio on Internet. ROI. That was a charming fictional moron named Russ Hanneman who invented radio on the Internet. He'll give us insight into the real Mark Cuban. Here's the real Mark Cuban's story of how he invented ROI. I'm not saying the story's real, but Mark Cuban has told this story, repeated it, some version of it for decades.
Then one of my buddies from college, Todd Wagner, sat down with me, and this was in 1995. He was like, you know, there's this whole new thing called the Internet. There's got to be a way we can use this to listen to Indiana basketball. We set up this website called AudioNet, and the next thing you know, video comes along and we turned it into a company called broadcast.com. And so we started what turned out to be the very first streaming company.
No, you didn't. That was Mark's story until 2012 when Chris Jabe did an extremely rare interview.
Interview will talk about how Mark Cuban came into the story, but I'm wondering are you ever resentful that people say that Mark Cuban is the founder and completely write you out of the story?
Yeah, of course, there's a little bit of that. It's hard not to because of the way it sort of ended up, in it being promoted in the media, and because of the way he positioned the story.
That was Cameron Chris Jabe. He started Cameron Audio Networks in 1989. He was the original founder of what would become AudioNet and then broadcast.com, but his name wasn't on all the press releases, news articles, videos, documentaries, incredible Silicon Valley shows. This smile got all the recognition. Watch.
Of course not, but I do it anyway, because I want it.
You're putting your entire future in the hands of the man who put radio on the internet. I can only assume that he mentioned that to you.
It may have come up. Oh, this guy? That's the guy?
Yeah, that's the guy.
Does he actually smile like that with his upper and lower teeth at the same time?
The guy is a joke.
How does he even do that?
He's a boorish, pompous, womanizing douchebag.
Chris's name wasn't even on the Wikipedia page as a founder. And
boorish.
That's the guy.
Does he actually smile like that with his upper and lower teeth at the same time?
The guy is a joke.
How does he even do that?
He's a boorish, pompous, womanizing douchebag.
Chris's name wasn't even on the Wikipedia page as a founder until that 2012 interview, until after it. Chris started with broadcasting sports events inside stadiums with these like radio pager things, but says, what about outside of stadiums? He started working on maybe the first satellite radio company, but the internet gets fast in 1994. Real fast, a whole 28.8 kilobytes home modem fast. That's like 0.028 of a megabyte fast. Okay, that's stupid slow. Co-founder Todd Wagner, Mark's lawyer, introduces Chris to Mark in late 1994 and
within 10 minutes of me giving him this pitch that I'd given 100 times, Mark said, I'm in, I'll do it. And at that point, he gave me a check for $10,000 and said, and on the bottom of that check, it said 2% of the company. And at the time, I really didn't think anything of it, so I took the check.
Classic Mark. He's the only one on earth with this genius ability.
I guess the other thing is, like you see on Shark Tank, I can look at any business. I don't care what it is. And in 10 seconds, I know all about the business. And so...
Right. He must be a billionaire from Shark Tank alone. No?
Are you up all time on Shark Tank investments?
Nah, not... Am I up financially?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I've gotten beat.
Really?
A couple.
No. Well, as Russ Hanneman says, it's not always about the money.
You know, one of the things being in the 3 Comma Club has taught me, Richard, is it's not always about money. Sometimes it's about wisdom. Did I lose a B? Close to it. But I bet I gained 2B in wisdom.
So you lost it all?
One of them worked.
One out of 36?
Well, Mark Cuban got this one right. 2, actually. Mark Cuban had a successful computer integration business that he sold to CompuServe before this. He's not an idiot, not a complete idiot. He really had a talent for hooking up computers, installing software, servers, and he knows how to sell BS. A lot of it. Come to think of it, Russ Hanneman isn't a complete moron either.
Start a subscription revenue model?
What? Revenue? No revenue. I'll call you back. What? Why would you go after revenue?
Russ Hanneman isn't a complete moron either.
Start a subscription revenue model?
What? Revenue? No revenue. I'll call you back. What? Why would you go after revenue?
Because to make money?
No. If you show revenue, people will ask how much, and it will never be enough. It's not about how much you earn. It's about what you're worth. And who's worth the most? Companies that lose money.
Probably a coincidence. Anyway, when Broadcast.com sold to Yahoo,
Enough. It's not about how much you earn. It's about what you're worth. And who's worth the most? Companies that lose money.
Probably a coincidence. Anyway, when Broadcast.com sold to Yahoo for about $5.7 billion, they were making negative $16 million on sales of $22 million. Yes, you do the math. Companies that are worth the most lose money. Chris needed more money to lose fast. This was the dot-com boom era. He asked for $1 million from Mark, but Mark only gave him that check for $10K. But remember, at the bottom, it said for 2% of the company. This became a giant problem. Mark wanted his investment non-dilutable. Why?
Things will come back, so we try to be protective in the contract so that you can't just immediately raise money 2 days later. You can't immediately dilute us in other ways, and just
Now, non-dilutable is smart. Otherwise, an evil investor can just issue new shares of stock and dilute your shares. And screw you out of your own company. It's how Mark Zuckerberg screwed over his co-founder, Eduardo Saverin. All you need to do is pump out more shares for yourself and dilute the other founder's shares. Easy.
He's wired in. Sorry? He's wired in.
Is he?
Yes.
You issued 24 million new shares of stock.
You were told that if new investors came along...
How much were your shares diluted? How much were his?
But Chris says, hold on, hey,
This non-dilutable doesn't make sense. It's not fair to all the other investors.
Mark, it's not really fair if I make your shares non-dilutable because my family has been investing in this for 5 years and all their shares are dilutable. They argue about it for a few months, and then Real Audio Player comes out, and Mark says, what?
Mark said, Chris, I really don't need you. You really don't have that much to add. I can pretty much do or get people to do what you're doing. So I was a little bummed, to say the least.
But then Mark says, hey, wait, hold on, just kidding. I actually do need you. Chris had been calling 80 to 100 broadcasters per day from all over the country acquiring streaming rights. Plus, when guys named Mark steal companies, founders sue.
And I'll bet what you hated the most is that they identified me as a co-founder of Facebook, which I am. You better lawyer up, asshole, because I'm not coming back for 30%. I'm coming back for everything.
So Mark Cuban has a better idea.
What if I just bought your company?
It's not for sale.
Yes, it is.
Go to hell.
Hey,
I'll call you, Turtle.
Thank you, Mark, for that.